Hello and welcome to another episode of the Technical SEO podcast. Today I am joined by Itamar Blauer, who is the Senior SEO Director at StudioHawk. Good afternoon, Itamar.
Hello, Dan. How's it going?
Yeah, not too bad. I'm not going to be British and complain about the weather, but it's too hot.
You've already said not too bad. That's the most British answer you could possibly have given.
Yeah, it's the default of we will never grumble, we will never complain, and we'll never be too proud. But if there's a queue, we'll stand in it. So on today's episode, Adam is joining me to have a frank conversation around one of the hotter topics in SEO news space and kind of a tech news space at the moment, and that is around OpenAI's beta launch of SearchGPT. Many months ago, they said they weren't going to make a search engine, and heaven behold, we now have beta tests for one. But I've got some thoughts on it. Item has got some thoughts on it. So yeah, I kind of guess, Item, what are your initial thoughts on the beta launch of a search engine?
I mean, it's one of those things where it's like I'm struggling to get excited nowadays with announcements. And I remember like the last one that really kind of caught my attention was Apple, when Apple were like, "Oh, well, we're gonna do this," and then at the time it was like, "Okay, Apple, massive company, lots of money, they could do it," but then it just sort of like went quiet. And then obviously, as you mentioned, OpenAI said previously they weren't going to make a search engine. Now they backtracked on that and it's releasing SearchGPT in beta. And I'm like, wow, color me shocked. These big companies sort of going back on their word on things. I'm just personally not that excited, but I'm intrigued because I feel like if they're actually going to put out in beta, this is going to be the sort of first real chance that we get to see what on earth is going on. Like it might be absolutely terrible, but fundamentally, I'm not that excited about it. I don't know about yourself.
Yeah, the year. I mean, 3, 4, maybe. Okay, that's probably been generous. 5, 6 years ago, when you had the launch of new search engines, the Google killers, and all the press kind of went mad for it and things like that. But nothing's ever kind of gone to that fruition. I think, yeah, again, using your phrase, colour me shocked, that they've gone back on their word. I mean, I've got some of these I've gone into in a bit of whether or not it'll actually launch or not as a search engine, but I think it's a good indicative measure of where the market is going in terms of how potentially companies are taking in those huge user data points and better understanding how users are generally discovering things, not only just in SEO but across marketing the spectrum, really.
Yeah, I mean, because the thing that always strikes me, especially with OpenAI, because OpenAI is essentially known for one main thing, which is ChatGPT, right? So with ChatGPT being what it is, which is an LLM, then it's a sort of like a really interesting shift where search engines fundamentally is information retrieval. They're different types of systems. They work quite differently. So when Google, for example, tried to introduce AI overviews and SGE as sort of LLMs within an information retrieval system, I was like, okay, well, this is just a bit weird. And it's just the sort of thing where now I'm like, okay, well, how is this exactly going to work? Like, yeah, sure, OpenAI is great in terms of, being used, or what it has done, which is sort of revolutionize and really like move to the mainstream the concept of LLMs. But can it do the same in terms of just creating a completely different system? I don't know.
I mean, to echo that point, I just turned around because it's interesting that you say obviously that search engines are effectively information retrieval systems. This is probably going to the geek extent of me, but the actual principles of Google haven't actually changed since 1968. When Jared Salton actually put this book out here, for those who aren't aware, it's the automatic information organization and retrieval, which was basically the SALT and mechanisms behind it. But I could understand Google potentially looking at AI overviews and things like that, and other AI tools like the virtual try-on, for example, to enhance that user discovery experience. But for ChatGPT or OpenAI to move into this kind of search field, I mean, I think if one of the statistics out there is it's something like $700,000 a day running costs just for ChatGPT because of the amount of processing power. It's clearly not making. I mean, if that's making money with those running costs, then we're clearly in the wrong industry. But it kind of feels like a weird shift, and the fact that they've only actually launched it to 10,000 people as a beta test makes me more think we're probably looking at user interface testing potentially for ChatGPT and other core products they have versus actually wanting to launch a search engine, kind of like how Hrefs were looking at launching. Is it Hey or You or
Yep.
one of the two? Yeah, because there's a lot of effort that needs to go into that with adoption curves.
Well, the adoption curve here is the biggest question, because we're talking about, you're mentioning all of these running costs, very expensive to run. But also, even with ChatGPT, they've sort of like, when it was, if we're going back several months, when premium for a lot of people was worth getting because you could, attach documents, there was a lot more it could do. That was the actual pull for people to actually spend money on it. But now, even with a free ChatGPT account, you can still pretty much get a lot of what previously you couldn't do. So then what are they going to do with SearchGPT? If they're going to have a sort of subscription-based thing where maybe you can only make a few searches every day, that's going to annoy people because you're not limited on Google in terms of how many searches you can make or what you can really do. So how are they actually going to monetize that, which is, I think, the million-dollar question here.
Yeah, and there's some speculation I've seen on X and on LinkedIn and stuff about how the Perplexity route, but Perplexity's just gone down might be route they do. So just with regards to their Perplexity are now looking to monetize and pay publishers for better content presentation through their search engine, information retrieval engine. But then you kind of look at that as an adoption curve. Well, if that's just publishers and news publishers, you have other news aggregator apps and third-party apps that are already very well and long established, already have high levels of market penetration, high levels of user retention, and it just becomes one of those, what is the USP for that user to move? And I think you hit me on the head there with, if it's limited searches a day, who would set their default search engine on any device to be something which they'll have to purposefully move away from at some point in the day? And that's adding a friction point. Then it's the ad route and adoption. And I think like most new techs, like if you look at the Mastodons, Blue Skies, Threads, we all made accounts in the first week. And the only time I ever go on Threads now is when I'm scrolling on Instagram and I mistake a Thread thing for an actual Instagram thing, and then I immediately get annoyed with it. So that's not really going to build a business case around the advertising. Oh, that probably sounded horrendous. So yeah, it's interesting how that's kind of move around. But I mean, do you actually think they will ever actually launch a search engine from this?
I mean, I think they will? I think they will, but what we might find is that, well, actually, it really depends if it sort of gets out of this beta stage with, positive types of feedback. And because otherwise it's just like, what's the point of releasing it if people don't want it? Because otherwise people won't use it. And if it's already, draining a bunch of money, then from a business perspective, it doesn't make sense for them to continue with it. But I think that at least for the beta stages, because I'm still on the wait list, I still want to sort of have a look to see what it's going to do. But I still would like to see it there. The only thing that I sort of worry about is, like you mentioned, the Threads example. This is Meta. This is, Instagram. This is massive companies that have been around for decades at this point, and they weren't able to do it. They weren't able to create something new and get mass adoption. And that's a problem. And this is what I sort of see even with the traditional search engine landscape of, like, how is the USP going to be any different in terms of search engines? It's like, okay, well, we might want to pay creators. It's like, okay, great. But do users actually care about that? Like, a user just wants the place where you can search for something and get the right answer. And I think until Google, and don't get me wrong, Google at the moment is doing some funky things, with a lot of stuff, it's kind of shooting itself in the foot. But unless Google continues to go down this route and continues to slip up and go downhill to give people enough of a reason to switch, and when I say switch, I mean switch for good. I mean, change all of your default settings and only use these particular types of search engines or platforms or software or whatever it is. That's such a difficult thing to do, which I don't really see OpenAI doing, if I'm being honest.
Oh no, I echo all that entirely. And I mean, even with Google's self-inflicted slip-ups in the past few months, year and a half or so, Bing have only actually made something like a 1.5 to 2% global market share grab. The only real data we have on major landscape changes has actually been in Russia. So at the end of 2021, the Roskomnadzor in Russia, the monopolies tech kind of, it's got a really long-winded name. They passed a piece of legislation which kind of targeted Google specifically with their monopoly on sort of Android devices. So in Russia, Android has a huge penetration of iPhone, and they had to create a widget which enabled users to choose default search engine by default. And back then, it was about a 50-50 split between Yandex and Google. In the 18 months to 2 years since, it's become more like a 65-35 in favor of Yandex because users have adopted it and moved away and made that shift. One thing which I find interesting is just some of the wording on the Search GPT waitlist page, or whatever you want to call it, and that is just around the while this prototype is temporary, we plan to integrate the best of these features directly into ChatGPT in the future. So I kind of see this as more we want to use ChatGPT itself as the product and use that information retrieval process and have more people using the core product, but we need the user data and we need the UX feedback and the retrieval feedback of how to present this better as you would a search engine. So the way we're going to do that is create a pseudo search engine, collect that feedback, and then bolt it into that core system.
Right. Yeah. And I think that's exactly how it's going to play out, because this was actually something that I commented on an SEO Slack channel, where I think that the best play OpenAI can do is integrate this Search GPT functionality within ChatGPT and that sort of product and that UI, because what you don't want is users having to switch between different types of processes or websites and different things. You want everything to just be centralized in this one area. So if I'm on ChatGPT and I have the option between using it for LLM reasons or using it for IR reasons, then it's just easy to click and sort of toggle between those, as opposed to then having to go on a completely new different site. So I do think, though, when you're reading that, I actually think they've probably thought of that for sure. And what they may be doing is just getting some user feedback, testing with beta, see how it is, and then be able to switch, or maybe on the main ChatGPT interface of having like a toggle between ChatGPT or the LLMs and SearchGPT and the IR is what I think will most likely happen with this.
I mean, but necessarily, even with a correct UI, doesn't even need to be a toggle. If you kind of look at the Bing Copilot model of how they retrieve AI things at the moment, it's quite a short response. And then you have a choice to expand the response or go directly to other sources. So it's kind of, that's half doing a halfway job kind of both at the moment. But I think also from how the market is shaping out, it could also be a potentially interesting place. A lot of Google's features seem quite mobile focused. So like circle to search, that's realistically mobile. Google Lens, all the images, Google's AI magic tool, everything is focused around mobile. In all the advertisements or the examples, it's heavily mobile. The taking a video of a broken record player they revealed at I/O and asking what's wrong with it, that's mobile. Everything ChatGPT feels more desktop. It feels like a different user case and a different use case, and it's potentially kind of going like, we will not be able to compete with that because we don't have a hardware penetration. We don't have the deals with people like Samsung to be actually running adverts for us on circle to search kind of thing, like they are doing in the UK and probably elsewhere. So it's kind of, we're going to attack the market, but a different segment of it, and we're going to not try to compete with Google. We're going to cohabit with Google on a slightly smaller market segment.
Yeah, and I think over time they can improve on that and sort of like get more capabilities, get more of these sort of partnerships with the Samsungs of the world. But yeah, for now, I think, if it is sort of like a desktop push where, there's the app for ChatGPT on mobile, which I only really use if I like forgot to do something in the day and I thought about something, and then I can just go on it and use the voice toggle just to be able to speak what I'm thinking and just sort of abstract and get it down, which I wouldn't really do on desktop. But I think for this kind of Search GPT experience that they're getting here, that will probably be a more sort of desktop heavy type of interface? Because I mean, I don't know the stats in terms of the consumption of ChatGPT based on desktop versus mobile device versus tablet devices, but I would think that it's mostly on desktops, especially because a lot of people use it for work. So if like you're going to be already working on a laptop or a computer or desktop or whatever, you're probably going to just have it up there and use it in that interface. So then again, it's a question of use case. It's a question of like, who's the ideal, what's the ICP here? Who are we actually targeting? Which, I mean, I don't actually know. From OpenAI's perspective, I have no idea what they're doing.
No, I kind of feel they have, because ChatGPT was so big and kind of was the champagne bottle on the bow of the ship that launched a lot of the mainstream consumption of LLMs. I kind of feel they've grown into a we're in a Google position, we're not quite Google in the sense of they're looked to as kind of regarded as market leader, and they have to still push, they have to maintain, there's the investment. I still think they're kind of a hot topic and they need to maintain that, and if they don't, that's when they can run into issues with shareholder funds and investors and everything else that goes on, and whatever Sam Altman is or isn't going to try and do next in terms of those things. But lastly, going back to one of the things you kind of said, we started off early on, it's like talking around adoption curve, and like you said, people have to switch for good. A good example of this is back when I used to live back at home, so going back 20 plus, well, 20, well, no, is it 20 years? No, Christ, maths. 15 or so years. Opera was quite a popular browser at the time. It had less consumption than Chrome, and I moved my dad onto Opera. He's not tech savvy. He only moved to Chrome 2 years ago because when I asked him what you do, he was still on Opera, and just because it was working, he never shifted. So now he's on Chrome, thankfully. So it's different demographics are going to change. I always think that we need to remember that, because if we fell into an ICP, we're not the same as most or a majority of the population, because we're tech focused. We're looking at this. I mean, we're here talking about this now. We're talking about things that 60-70% of the world probably isn't even aware of. So we always need to remember that kind of lens we have, I guess, on the situation.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think if you're trying to create something for mass market, it's going to have to be for the majority of people. So it's like, what is your fundamental problem that you're solving? And is it possible for anyone in the world, theoretically, who doesn't know who you are, to be able to use this SearchGPT in this example and be able to use it as, intuitively as possible without getting confused? And I suppose then the question of switching is, people need a reason to do that. And I think it's like, OpenAI is going to have to provide that reason one way or another, because if it doesn't, then it will just be another thing people may just use for certain types of instances, but won't necessarily be able to do what I suspect they would ultimately want, which is to get a lot more of the search engine market share in the space.
No, definitely. I think that's a good kind of closing point to draw it on an end to. It's going to be an interesting next few months from a SearchGPT and OpenAI perspective. So I'd like to take this opportunity to say that is everything. So I'd like to thank you again to Itamar for taking time out of a busy day to join me. And thank you all for listening, whether or not you're at home, in the car, or just trying to chunk through an Excel spreadsheet with keywords. If you've liked this episode, please don't forget to subscribe to the channel or follow the audio version of this on your favorite podcast app or wherever you found this. We're on Spotify, Stitcher, all of them through distribution. So I've been Dan Taylor, and this has been the Tech SEO podcast. Thank you very much for listening.